In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only oversaturated, glorious Technicolor model paint. My name's Guy, you're watching Midwinter Minis, and if you're anything like me, this paint set will have a special place in your heart. Back in 1994, when the Citadel Color paint set was released, it's fair to say Games Workshop were on a bit of a roll. Having just released starter sets for Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000 the previous years, their products were now being sold in toy shops around the world, giving many people their first ever taste of tabletop wargaming and miniature painting. And also, I was 9 and I wore socks with shorts. What a style icon. At the time, experienced hobbyists were mostly using enamel paints for miniatures, but for newcomers to the hobby, this stuff had a pretty steep learning curve. You also needed harsh chemicals to thin it and clean your brushes. Not very kid-friendly, and it was often quite hard to get smooth results. It was time for an acrylic revolution. Now, this 94 set certainly wasn't the first acrylic model paint range on the market. It wasn't even the first acrylic paint range that Games Workshop created. We'll maybe touch on those at some point in the future, but it certainly was era-defining. I was lucky enough to find this set in a comments section on Facebook. A very nice chap called Al was talking about his as-new sealed paint set, and I messaged him with an offer. Long story short, this box made its way out to Australia in the 90s, and in 2020 it made a return journey back to the UK. Now, I realised finding something so old, at least in hobby terms, in sealed, unused condition is incredibly rare. So I'm going to share this experience with you, and hopefully do it justice so you can get as much enjoyment out of it as possible, and leave a lasting tribute to this iconic little set. It also means that after 2 years of running a Warhammer channel, I'm finally going to paint a Space Marine and a fantasy miniature on camera. Okay, let's take a look. Glorious fantasy style 90s box art. 10 paints, 2 minis and a brush. Pretty much everything you need in one box. A perfect birthday present or pocket money investment. Back in the day, I bought mine for £9.99, about £20 in today's money, which is actually pretty much bang on the prices of Games Workshop's current starter paint sets that feature models as well. Although the newer ones feature more models, fewer paints, and one of the worst paintbrushes ever put into production. I mean, honestly. Anyway, the Citadel Color paint set provides you with everything you need to start painting Citadel miniatures. Inside this box, you'll find 10 Citadel Color paints, a high-quality nylon brush, 2 finely detailed Citadel miniatures, and a guide that explains how to paint your models. The specially formulated water-based acrylic paints and washes are fully intermixable and completely non-toxic. These paints have been chosen to form a good multi-purpose paint set that includes all the basic colours you'll need to paint any Citadel miniature. Pretty straightforward, eh? I think having both a fantasy and sci-fi model in the box really worked in their favour too. It was literally for everyone, no matter what you wanted to get into, and also allayed any fears you might have about working with harsh paints or chemicals like I mentioned earlier. This was also what I consider to be the golden age of paint names. Skull White, Chaos Black, Blood Red, Enchanted Blue, Goblin Green, Sunburst Yellow. There's a bit of flavour in them, evocative of what they actually might look like, but they still say the name of the actual colour. For me, the current range of Citadel paints lean a little bit too much on the flavour. I'm red-green colourblind, and some of the names found in the new starter sets, like Nighthaunt Gloom, Incubi Darkness, Rhinox Hide, Tesseract Glow, and Lead Belcher don't really give me too much to go on. Anyway, I don't want this video to turn into a 2020 Citadel paint bitch fest. I'll do that properly in another video. Let's crack this paint set open, shall we? Ta-da! What a sight to behold. First up, we've got the Citadel Color Painting Guide. A nice cover with an aspirational battle scene, some beginner-friendly tips on the stuff you need, how to prepare your models, and thin and mix your paints. There's also a step-by-step painting guide on the Space Marine and Chaos Warrior found in the box, which I'll be attempting to follow later in the video. There's also some examples of alternative paint schemes and impressive paint jobs from the Heavy Metal team. And there's also a guide to basing your finished models in the style of the time. On the back, there's a brochure for the full range of regular paints, metallics, washes, and glazes. Next up, we've got a nice nylon detail brush. Pretty good quality from the look of it. Made in England too. Fancy. Seems like it has a pretty decent tip as well. Very small for my taste, but certainly a good size for nailing finer details. We've got the Warhammer Chaos Warrior sprue, and his little square base. What a great model. Classic monopose mini that looked awesome all ranked up in an army. Next up, the legendary 93 Space Marine sprue, which we've already covered in more detail in our Warhammer 40,000 2nd edition unboxing video. There's also a little World of Hobby Games leaflet. Let's open it up. So we've got a couple of ads for the 40k and Warhammer starter sets, an ad for the hobby magazine White Dwarf, a list of Games Workshop stores and stockists all around the world, and what's this? A mail order starter pack. A Lizardman Saurus, Space Marine Terminator, 4 Citadel paints, a brush, a painting guide, and a brochure, all for £5. Well, stocks last. I mean, it's been 26 years, but it's worth a shot, right? Now for the paints. Blood Red, Mithril Silver, Flesh Wash, Snakebite Leather, Bronzed Flesh, Chaos Black, Skull White, Sunburst Yellow, Goblin Green, Enchanted Blue. They've been sitting in this box for almost 10,000 days, so hopefully they're still liquid, or at least can be revived. We'll find out in a minute. First, let's prepare the models for their moment in the spotlight. Clipping them off the sprues, I tend to leave about 1 millimeter of connection still on the model, and then I trim it off with a sharp knife. This stops me accidentally taking chunks out of the model. These little dudes have quite prominent mold lines, so I scrape them off with the back of my knife. In problem areas like the handle of the axe where the 2 halves of the mold haven't quite lined up, I use my scalpel to recut the grooves to make them a bit smoother. I also drilled the barrel out of the bolter, but I just pushed the power pack and gun onto the Space Marine without gluing them, as I want to keep them separate for easy painting later. But while I've got them built and unpainted, let's make a little Inception thumbnail. A little dream within a dream. I think it's a big time saver to apply the basing material before you prime. I still use a variation of this even on my newer models. Diluted PVA, sand, more diluted PVA, sand again, and 1 more coat of diluted PVA to seal the deal. Now all the models are ready to prime, I stuck them to some pizza box offcuts and gave them a couple of very light coats of white plastic primer. Priming white is an essential first step for using the paints in this set, and you'll see why soon. While I was at it, I also primed a couple of pieces of scrap plastic to test the paints out before I applied them to the models, just in case any of the paints had aged quite badly. Also, to hopefully bring any problem paints back to life, and thanks to the kind support of our lovely Patreon members, I managed to treat myself to one of these fancy paint shakers. It's a weird little heavy bottom tabletop vibrator, basically. You push the paint on it and it wiggles it really fast so you don't have to shake it yourself. Lazy, sure, but it seems to do the job. Okay, moment of truth. Oh yes. Absolutely perfect. I gave all the paints a quick test on the white primed plastic just to see how they cover and see their consistency. As expected, black, blue and green had really solid coverage. Red, yellow, flesh and silver were quite thin and you could clearly see the brush strokes. The wash was a much nicer colour than I remember actually. By and large, the paints were perfect. Here's what they look like after 1 coat on the white primer, and 2 coats. You can see that the blue and the black also have a little bit of a glossier finish than the other colours, but they're all really vibrant and work nicely straight out of the pot. All except poor old Skull White. Pretty solid, unfortunately, sort of like stiff fudge in consistency. Now, I spent the first 10 years of my working life on minimum wage, and it made me a thrifty bugger. Let's see if I can bring this back to life. I added thinner, I agitated it, I added sprue bits to rattle around in the bottle, I shook until my arms hurt, and I vibrated until my fingers were numb. Any signs of life? I mean, it's looking promising. Using my piece of grey primed plastic, I painted single, double and triple layer tests for it. But unfortunately, even though it actually applied quite well, it had these little gritty bits inside which render it pretty unusable unfortunately, at least for this video. Maybe it'll soften up over time, but for this project I'll swap it out for the white from Cote d'Arms, the closest thing I found to the original Citadel line yet. Using some blue tack, I mounted the models on the new Citadel paint pots, the only thing they're good for, and attached the power pack and bolter with cocktail sticks, which happened to be the perfect size to fit the holes. Now, this lovely 1994 detail brush that the set comes with could get ruined pretty quickly painting up huge areas of blue and red for the base coats and green on the bases, so just for these steps I swapped out to this old fat size 4 round brush. I gave the base rims and rough texture a single coat with Goblin Green straight out of the pot. Pretty good coverage. Next, I thinned the red and blue paints a little with water on my palette as instructed in the guide, and painted the armour on both the Ultramarine and the Chaos Warrior. Having tested out the paint, I'm already anticipating some problems with the yellow. It has absolutely zero opacity, it just stains the colour underneath with yellow, so I'll need to leave the trim on the pauldrons white. I then painted the gloves, boots and helmet on the Chaos Warrior black. I wasn't sure why one of the warrior's gloves was black and one was red in the guide, so I just decided to make them both black. I also base coated all the parts that would end up being silver with black, as the transparent silver paint over a white base coat would look a little bit washed out. Using white paint and the detail brush, I started tidying up areas that would be lighter colours, trying to make the borders between the colours as neat as I could. The process of tidying up edges was really tedious, to be honest. The red and yellow are both very transparent, so you can't really tidy up with the right colour. See, this red just makes the black underneath a reddy black. You need to fix your mistakes with white first, and then reapply your red or yellow. This makes the trim on the pauldrons already a tricky process, a bit of a nightmare. Now keep in mind I'm painting this with the camera in the way to give you the best possible viewing angle. It's much further away than I'd like to paint if I wasn't filming. Also, this paint is drying fast. Maybe it's because it's 10,000 days old, maybe it's because it's 36 degrees in my studio right now, 97 degrees in old money. What part of mid-winter minis don't you understand, weather? I know this little gem thing is going to be totally obscured by the bolt gun, but let's not start cutting corners now, eh? Alright, time for the first coat of Mithril Silver. As I mentioned, very transparent, but it has a really nice shimmer, with a slightly blue hue to it. With this retro painting style, neatness is key. It even says so in the guide. If you're not familiar with the way I usually paint on the channel, I try to get individual models, even characters, finished in less than an hour using speed painting techniques. These paints really don't lend themselves to that style though, so I have to take my time and be careful. Another coat of silver, another round of back and forth, fixing white, reapplying base coats, neatening things up. I'm pretty much there with the Chaos Warrior, somewhere between the what you can do with this paint set and the advanced techniques panel on the right. I dry fitted the ultramarine, and yeah, pretty much bang on with the basic painting guide. Even with a simple but neat paint job, this can look pretty great, especially when there are a few of them battling it out on the tabletop. These little dudes have waited 26 years for a paint job though, so I'll try out a few more advanced techniques on them to do them justice. Before that, I'd like to quickly give a shout out to my little gang of Patreon supporters who keep this channel alive, and let me do this kind of nonsense as an actual job. Welcome to our newest members: Sunny Day, Kevin Fowler, SKT90, Charles Shattuck, Lindsay Beaver, Jan Lukashevich, Panda Mahels, Ross Edwards, Ave Dominus Knox, In Love with Penance, Mimir, Lachlan McDougall, Ashley Newman, Scumbag Joseph, Nick Horton, Corey Harris, Irel, Anders Adrians, Renton Brax, Eamon Patton, Psychologist to the Astartes, Justin Grinnell, Gary, Henry Greisel, Craig Tuff, David Stormer, Andrew Pierce, Pitch, Grumble Bumpkin, Jordo, David Wright, Michael Nahr, and Ewan Rowett. Okay, let's get the messy step out of the way first. I mixed a little white into the yellow to give it some opacity and gently dry brushed the texture on the base to give it the full-on 90s AstroTurf look. I used the flesh wash to carefully recess shade the details on the Space Marine's Aquila and shaded the little skulls on the warrior. The one paint this set is missing was a black wash for armor shading and panel lining, so using Coat Darm's armor wash, I carefully black lined the armor panels on both models and shaded the chainmail and the axe head. I then mixed a tiny bit of white and yellow paint into the red and did a first pass of edge highlighting on the warrior's armor and the Ultramarine's bolt gun casing. Adding a tiny bit more white into the mix, I then did a few more selective edge highlights. Again, this is a bit of a compromise. I could have been neater without the camera between me and the model, but I've been doing this for 2 years now and I'm getting pretty used to it. As a preliminary highlight, not too bad. We can cut back into that red to refine the highlights later, but first I'll do the same thing for the other colours, just adding a tiny bit of white to each of the base coat colours and adding wide, then slightly brighter and more refined edge highlights. The painting guide shows the warrior with some bright point highlights on the knuckles and edges of the helmet. For things to read as black, stark highlights like this really sell the effect. Too much grey on flat areas and it just looks dark grey and not like metal painted black. Time to start cutting into the recess shading and highlights with the base coat colours again to clean things up. Thinned blue helped tidy up the ultramarine armor, and thinned red for the warrior, obviously. It's starting to look pretty clean. I mixed a tiny bit of white into the blue, thinned it quite a lot with water, and glazed the more top-facing sections of the ultramarine's armor, trying to give it that smooth transition highlight that old heavy metal models had. I tidied up the bases of the final coat of goblin green, almost ruining everything with an untimely sneeze,
Oh, Jesus.
and cracked out my transfers to add the finishing touch to the Emperor's finest. The box doesn't come with any transfers for the Marine, and I don't have any from back in the day, so I asked my patrons what they thought I should do. And yeah, the newer tactical squad transfers are pretty much identical. I went through the whole process of cutting them really close, cutting into the blank space so they can flex, soaking them and applying them. And you know what? I hate transfers on curvy parts. It never sits flat. And although wonky transfers with lumps and bumps would be pretty accurate for every model painted back then, and even though I said I would rather chew my own fingers off, I decided to freehand it. It basically involved the same paint, tidy, back and forth as all the previous steps. I marked out the rough shape, filled them in, tidied them up, and gave them another coat, and called it a day. Now, I know I'm not the best painter in the world, but I'm pretty happy with how these little minis turned out. They're vibrant, they're cool, they fill me with nostalgia, they make me remember lovely moments from my childhood and early teens with family and friends, and I hope you've enjoyed sharing this with me. It's been a really amazing experience to get my hands on this set again, my first ever model paint set, and have you along for the journey. By the way, if you love retro stuff like this, I've made a few more videos like it. I unboxed the 2nd edition 40k starter set, I painted up the little Gretchen, and also a super rare original Zote mini in period accurate style. I'll leave links in the video description if you fancy diving down that particular nostalgia rabbit hole. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider checking out our Patreon, but simply subscribing, liking, and commenting helps the channel out more than you'd think too. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye for now.